Hey guys, Miche-Miche here. The King is dead. Long live the King is the title of my latest CGI art piece. I am a firm believer in promoting knowledge sharing and peer learning to ignite our collective creativity and expression. So I am thrilled to unveil to you guys my entire creative process from start to finish. Now, I want to preface that this is going to be a long video, intended to be more of a conversation between you and I. However, for those of you who are only interested in specific sections of the breakdown, I've got you covered with a chapter's overview and timestamps. I do encourage you nevertheless to watch the full video to understand the context of my artistic choices. So over the course of February, Clinton Jones challenged thousands of 3D artists to express their unique interpretation of that very simple template. The rules are simple. Create a 5 seconds animated scene, keeping the idea and the shape of the staircase and a main character climbing up those stairs with the provided animation. Before we dive in, I have to say how astonished I am with the overall quality of submissions. Seriously, if you have not watched the top 100 montage yet, do yourself a favor, go watch it now, and only then resume this video. But with everyone's work being so beautifully crafted and creative, I could not believe it when I was awarded the 3rd place out of 2,800 talented artists from all around the world. So with regard to the thousands of hours of learning, trying, working, failing, persisting, perfecting my craft over the years, this result feels extremely rewarding to me. I really want to reassure aspiring artists who look up to the top 100 submissions and may feel intimidated or discouraged. Believe me, I have been in your shoes, wondering if I could even dream to reach the level within a couple lifetimes. It actually took me 5 participations to cleanse challenges to reach that rank, and I did not even get into the top 100 once until my 3rd submission. I can assure you that there is no secret ingredient apart from work, work and work. If you're passionate about the art you create, I know that you will get there one day. It's only a matter of time. So I always start my creations with the message, the idea. Now, this is a very personal opinion. You may not agree with me, but I think that the visuals should only be at the service of the idea. The purpose of the visual language is to convey the substance. It's a bit like a nice speech filled with fancy words and long-winded sentences and obscure references. If you don't have anything interesting to say, well, your nice speech is just an empty shell. Yeah, no, I really value what other artists have to share in terms of perspective, emotions, experiences, what they're generous enough to share with the world. But the concept or the idea behind the render does not necessarily need to be precisely worded out. In my case, it was more of an emotional state, a state of mind more than an explicit action. It's the calmness in the midst of battle. It's the rest within the rage. It's the brief moment suspended in time in which reverence and universal respect emerges from chaos. It's when the racket gives way to silence, when heads turn and when breath are held in. That short instant in time when clocks stop ticking and beauty and elegance trump despair and anguish. Now, with that general concept in mind, we have to find the words of the language, the visual elements, to convey it as genuinely as possible. What struck me at first when looking at the template is the sense of motion that's suggested by the twisted shape of the staircase, which is vanishing into the diagonal. And with the challenge name being Eternal Ascent, it only felt natural to play with that idea on multiple levels. Obviously, the staircase element is bringing a sense of direction to the ascension, but then we have the characters that are bringing a sense of motion, a decisiveness, an urge for elevation if you want, and we can add a 3rd layer on top, which would be a slow crawling, wave-like movement rippling upwards in the wake of the main character. Now, this will be important for guiding the eye where it needs to go and for pacing and slowing down the entire shot. And so the general rhythm of the render with the crowd kneeling in the wake of a majestic character came quite early on in the creative process. Now at this point, I like to start asking questions to the template. And I'm doing that by playing with some very rough blockouts inside of Blender. And I try to make sense of the visual language which I'm going to use. And to me, a funeral procession carries just the right elements, the right amount of gravity. Now, I will always recommend you to check out what other artists before you have expressed on similar topics. Not just in visual arts, but, any medium, any art style. In film, the movie The Seventh Seal has a notorious procession scene with a very interesting dynamic between the procession and the crowd. In traditional Bhutan culture, scheduled ceremonial processions are very vibrant and striking, perhaps even a little bit too much for what we're trying to achieve here. Of course, you just can't ignore traditional painting. There are so many pieces that have explored relevant topics. First, you got depictions of large processions or crowds or gatherings with a sense of directionality. There's the Procession of the League by François Bunel, which is flourishing with life and energy with great attention to detail to each and every characters. And you got the Procession to Calvary by Bruegel the Elder, which conveys the recurring theme in historical painting of both the carrying of the cross by the Christ and his subsequent lamentation, which is sort of the two faces of the same coin. And then you got the Wedding Procession by Bruegel the Younger, with a sense of ephemerality in the emotions. So here it's the joy of a wedding, but it's still in the middle of an immutable landscape that encompasses the characters. Then we have depictions of slower scenes with more gravity and more truth and honesty in the way they depict human emotions, like A Boreal at Ornans by Gustave Courbet, which takes a traditionally grandiose subject in history painting and paints it in a newfound sense of realism and linearity. In the face of death, we're all equally insignificant, and the raw human emotion is represented as truthfully as possible. Then you got some more traditional paintings of mourning and reactions to death, mostly centered around the figure of the Christ. The Madonna of Carmel and the Souls of the Purgatory by Tiepolo. You got the Descents from the Cross by Rubens, Lamentation by Giotto di Bondone, and The Entombment of Christ by Caravaggio. And finally, you got paintings aiming more at the intimacy of death and the carnal attachment. You've got La Pietà by Michelangelo, absolutely stunning sculpture. You've got the Burial of Attila by Giordet, The Death of Marat by Jacques David. I've also been greatly inspired by the naturalism of Thomas Cole, and specifically his rendering of nature, the abundancy of life, and how insignificant and short-lived human footprint is. And that's very strongly suggested in his 5-painting series that's named The Course of the Empire, which depicts the rise and the fall of an empire. Outside of the visual arts, music has also played its part. I think there's 2 pieces of music that greatly inspired me during the project. First one is Rachmaninoff's symphonic poem that's titled The Isle of the Dead, which I really recommend you go listen to right now if you haven't. And then there's a track from the movie Gladiator, which is called The Wheat, written by Hans Zimmer and performed by Lisa Gerard. I also want to briefly mention the cultural inspirations for the sets, the costumes, the props. I wanted the designs to speak to the viewer, not being too foreign in some sense, while still adding a little touch of exotism and novelty. So my inspirations were mostly from ancient Egypt, Assyria, Mesopotamia, ancient Greece, but also a bit of Far Eastern cultures and pagan traditions. I want to tackle the Queen and Hare characters first. In the project template, we were provided a mocap climbing animation, and we want to swap this placeholder with a custom character, so I first created this lady using HumanGen and made the armature using MetaRig. Now the next step is to transfer the provided animation to my custom rig, which is known as retargeting. Now what I did is slightly different from traditional retargeting. I used bone constraints to match the animation on very specific key parts, mostly the feet and the hips. And thanks to inverse kinematics, the rest of the body parts will naturally find their place during the animation. I've then added some secondary motion to the animation, mostly the heels lifting up before taking each step, or some subtle sway in the shoulders, the arms, and of course some head rotation. Now I made the baby using Make Human and I gave it a similar armature from MetaRig. But since the baby is supposed to be dead, and therefore inert and floppy, his legs and arms are supposed to bounce around. And the easiest way to do this is by using the Bone Dynamics plugin, which automatically adds those motions using Blender simulations. Now let's talk about the dress. Based on the cultural references which I mentioned earlier, I started by gathering some interesting pieces of clothes, especially from ancient Egypt. I love the Uzek necklaces, as well as the Nemes. But most importantly, I greatly admire the work of Trisha Bigar, who was the lead costume designer for Star Wars. And particularly, she made the numerous costumes worn by Padme Amidala. And there are such interesting shapes and colors and textures to take inspiration from. Then I went ahead and started drawing some sketches on paper. Was looking for the right shapes and volumes. I gave her a meter to suggest her status, but I didn't want it to look too stereotypically religious. So I tried softening the shapes and looked for more natural angles. From there, I used Marvelous Designer to make the dress itself. Now, the key when making digital clothing is to always stick to what works in real life. I found this awesome blog called Rosalie's Medieval Woman, which I'll link in the description, that explains how to sew medieval dresses. It's all shown in a very practical manner and it's easy to follow. I did my best to make something believable in Marvelous Designer, with multiple layers and some interesting details. The simulation itself is not particularly complex. One key element is to add variety in the fabric materials based on their function and purpose. The inner layers of the dress are more elastic and flexible because they need to stick to the skin and be comfortable to wear. So silk is a good candidate here. But on the other hand, the outer layers of the dress are more protective, so they would be thicker and stiffer like wool. Now I have a couple tips for simulating clothes in Marvelous Designer. First, you can use the layer system when sewing the garments together to ensure that each piece of clothes remains where it should be. However, that setting must absolutely be turned off when simulating, otherwise you will get artifacts and bad results. Second, make sure you use the right time step during the simulation. This number represents the amount of real time that passes frame after frame. By default, it has a value of 0.03333, which is 1/30 or 30 FPS. If we simulate and export like that, Marvelous Designer will assume that our original animation was also in 30 FPS, but since our project is actually in 24 FPS, even though the speed of the animation will be completely fine, the gravity, bounciness, and the physics of the cloth will look odd because they will be slightly accelerated. In fact, 30/24 equals to 1.25, so we know that they will react to physics 25% too fast. So we must change this setting to 1/24, and that equals to 0.041667. Next, if you want your simulation to be more realistic, you need to turn on nonlinear simulation and turn off GPU simulation. If you have weird collisions or cloth garments sticking to each other, I found that the only relevant parameter is the number of simulations. I've made a mistake in the past of increasing the self-collision iteration count, and honestly, anything above 1 or 2 will actually decrease the quality of your simulations. Finally, you can also set your CG finish condition to residual and decrease its value to something super small. Think of this number as the margin of error accepted by the simulation when vertex have trouble finding their ideal position. For example, when two vertices collide and should be repelled by each other, a smaller value will force the simulation to take more time to find the ideal outcome. To create the material of the dress, I used this interesting fabric pattern I found on the Smithsonian Open Access Library, which, by the way, is an absolute goldmine of a reference library. I tiled it in Photoshop using the content-aware fill, and then I created texture maps using Substance Designer. I then painted the entire dress texture maps inside of Substance Painter using the pattern maps I generated, and trying to give an interesting combination of gold and dark green colors. In Blender, the shader itself for the dress is very simple. It's a simple BSDF shader that uses the base map from Substance with a bit of sheen for the velvet aspect of the cloth. And I have to admit, I did spend way too long on some details that are not even visible in the final render, such as these embroidered writings on the dress, but hey, at least it was good fun. Now, the issue with my initial concept is that it calls for a large amount of people in the crowd. If the crowd is too sparse, it just doesn't work. Now, in my block-out, I ended up being satisfied with a crowd of 66 people, which is absolutely insane and way too overambitious, but I guess I'm a bit stubborn, so I went with it anyways. The most essential thing when dealing with large amount of heavy assets is to keep things optimized as early on as possible. In that case, each character is comprised of multiple similar elements: a skeleton, a body mesh, costume. We want to use instances for things that are shared among multiple assets. This ensures that we only load those assets once in memory instead of 66 times. Here's one concrete example. Even though all the characters have a different skin color, they're all actually using the same shader. That means 66 times less memory. Now, the trick is extremely simple. We're just adding random variations within the shader driven by the object data. Now let's focus a bit on their animation. Hand animating is difficult, but it's definitely achievable if you simplify the process and you take it one step at a time. First off, you need to get up off your chair and act it out yourself. Perform the animation slowly multiple times. Try to get a feel for the gravity and balance. Stop at multiple moments during the movement and ask yourself, if I unclench my muscles right now, do I fall down? And if yes, am I falling down backwards, on the side, downwards? That gives you a good indication on where the balance is at all stages of the movement. A simple rule of thumb for balance is that you are balanced when your center of gravity lays within the area of your joints resting on the ground. When standing upright, my center of gravity falls between my feet. I'm balanced. And I lose this balance the second my center of gravity goes beyond that area. Performing the movement also helps you decompose a complex action into smaller parts. So when I kneel down, I need both feet to be spread apart in a vertical line to allow the legs to bend when I lower myself. And from a standing position, I can get there either with a front step of my dominant leg or a back step of my non-dominant leg. Also notice how your pelvis moves while you are doing that front step. When I raise my leg and move it further, I am shifting my center of gravity forwards. The center of gravity is not aligned with my ankle anymore, and that unbalances me and makes my pelvis fall forward until my front leg contacts the ground and absorbs the pelvis movement. That will help you time correctly the movement of the pelvis compared to the foot. And then as I lower myself, I can either squat directly down, which will make me use my glutes and hamstring, and which isn't the natural way to kneel, or I can lower myself a bit more towards the front, which is almost effortless, but that shifts my center of gravity even further in the front, so now I need to use my arms against my dominant leg to absorb that additional movement of the chest and keep my balance. When my knee is about to contact the ground, I am going to drastically expand the balance area, which becomes a triangle formed by my foot, my knee, and my other foot. That means that I can now move my chest backwards to its resting position. All in all, that kneeling movement can be summarized as the shape of the letter Z. Of course, with 66 different characters, you're gonna have to add some variety into that. People don't kneel the same, not at the same speed, not with the same energy. Some have weaker legs and stronger arms, or the opposite. Some are kneeling on stone, and that will be uncomfortable for the knees, and so on and so forth. When it comes to actually animating, start by focusing on the key joints to make up the majority of the movement. That will be the pelvis and the feet. Only when the global movement is blocked out and the balance is correct, you can add the secondary animations, like the head turning. Also, think of the position of the characters in the crowd. Are they watching the queen climbing up before kneeling? Or maybe they're more in the back and they struggle to see her, so they're looking more at the people around them and they react a bit later. Now we still want that crawling movement of people kneeling one after each other to produce that visual wave movement upwards the stairs. So we also have to time each character's movements to achieve that. Now let's talk about the clothings. It's all made in Marvel's Designer as well. I wasn't sure if I wanted the crowd to be mostly loyalty and nobles and priests, or a mix of peasants and middle class people. But anyway, the main takeaways from my little research on ancient clothing is that most garments are very simple in their conception. Ancient Egyptian robes are nothing more than a rectangular garment which is wrapped in a way that gives it an interesting shape. The nemes, which also looks complex and intimidating when worn on the head, is not much more than a rectangular garment that's been cut in curved angles. Using those simple principles, I made a few variations of clothing which, by combining together and changing a little bit each time, helped getting 66 unique costumes rather quickly. Now, in terms of shading, the clothes all share similar shaders. There's a lot of randomness which is involved in the shader to break up the patterns and make each one quite different. I'm using multiple noise nodes set in multiply mode to break up the regularity of the albedo channel, as well as the sheen and specular values. I started by building a height map using Gaia. Now, the strength of this software is that it allows you to quickly generate realistic terrain based on erosion effects on the ground. In Blender, to have the most control over the mountain's geometry in my scene, I used a geometry node setup. So I'm basically starting from a plane, but because the plane is centered on 0 and its dimensions go from -0.5 to +0.5, and the texture coordinates of the height map is in 0 to 1, we start by moving the plane like so. Then we subdivide it and we displace each vertex based on the corresponding height map value. And the geometry node setup allows us to quickly adjust the height and the various parameters that we want. It also allows me to easily extract portions of the background to selectively add more geometry where we need to. We also want to add an atmosphere to give more realism and depth to the background. So in a large mesh volume, I started with 2 different gradients, which represent the density of the atmosphere both in altitude and in the distance. And I've combined them both to drive the density of a volume scatter shader and a volume absorption shader. I've also used a plane with a Musgrave texture driving the alpha channel to cast some interesting cloud shadows on the background. Now let's talk about the set for a minute. In my early blockouts, I played with different dispositions of stone blocks on both sides of the staircase where the crowd would stand. I've also played with the idea of verticality by introducing columns at various intervals. And I wasn't sure at that point if the scene was going to take place outside or inside a building, but I think I liked the ambiguity of it. I tried to arrange the stones in an irregular fashion. The intention here is that this temple, or whatever the stairway leads to, is not necessarily actively used, more like an ancient temple that's only used for very special occasions. Now, the stone aspect that spoke to me the most in that manner is rocks of this style, those old worn-out granite or sandstone blocks laid out and weathered by time and nature. Now, once I was satisfied with the overall placement of the stones, I started sculpting some details on them using texture maps I've prepared from Google Images. And I've tried my best to add both large and smaller details to make it as realistic as possible. For the plants, I used the free plugin from Grassworld, which is called G-Scatter, which allowed me to very quickly spread vegetation in all the little crevices and cracks of the stairs. And then I've added some ivy all over the place using the ivy generator from Baga, which relies on geometry nodes to allow for fast iteration and placement in the scene. Modeling the columns themselves was not too difficult using reference images, and I did not get too fancy with them. I've just used some basic Greek columns designs. I think that this helps bring a touch of familiarity in the overall artistic direction. For the stone block material themselves, I once again did my best to break the repetition of textures by introducing some randomness in the tiling thanks to object info nodes. Also some additional noise mixed together with various blend modes. For the lighting, I started by searching for a good sun angle. The idea is to push the contrast and find a nice sun angle that produces some beautiful highlights and silhouettes. We want the scene to be as readable as possible in its most basic shapes. If the scene is too noisy, even at that simplified stage, it's definitely going to be difficult to read later on. In the late afternoon, when the sun gets lower on the horizon, the light rays need to go through a thicker part of the atmosphere, which is increasing the scattering. Now, the effect is twofold. One, it changes the sunlight color, and two, it also creates some softer shadows. So what I did is that I doubled the sun. The first sun is a sharper version with a color temperature closer to warm afternoon daylight at around 4200 Kelvin. And the second one is a little dimmer with a much warmer color temperature of around 3400 Kelvin and a much larger angular diameter, producing some very diffuse shadows. And when both suns superpose, we still have the energetic highlights from the main sun, but with an additional warm glow around the shadow fringes, which is helping to shape the ethereal, almost dreamlike look of the scene. But we need to talk about lighting intention. Early on in the creative process, I wanted to shape my lit and shadowy areas to help convey the story. By building cards to block the sunlight in certain places, my goal was to focus most of the sunlight onto the queen and hair, while keeping most of the rest in the shadows. It helps to frame the shot and to direct the eyes to the main elements, but it's also giving a subtext indication of how the characters are feeling in the scene. The queen steps out of the shadow into the light, but will eventually step back into some more shadows. The idea here is that the hair being dead is a very ominous event for the people in the scene that has dreadful consequences in their world. However, this ceremonial procession is a form of hope. The queen carries the dead infant to the top of the temple where a priestess might try to resuscitate him. However, at that point in the story, the future remains uncertain and all remains to be done, hence the additional shadows further up the stairs. By this point, I'm satisfied with the overall lighting, but the surroundings are still stealing too much attention from the main elements. So I'm adding additional rim lights to the main characters using light linking to ensure that only them are affected by those lights. This helps to reinforce the silhouettes and detach the main characters from the set and the background. But these lights need to remain subtle because we don't want the viewer to be aware of that trick. The angle doesn't match the sun, and it's risking to pull the viewer out of his suspension of disbelief. Over the months, the scene has become way too heavy to be rendered all at once. And I have a pretty beefy computer, so we do have an optimization issue. And sure, I could probably optimize the scene and get to the point where I can render everything all at once, but what I'm saying is it's only a 5 seconds animation, and I'm probably not gonna come back to it after the challenge is over. If you're going to spend longer optimizing your scene than what you will gain with a slightly faster render, it's probably not worth the hassle. So I have separated my render layers like so. I have one for the background, one for the midground, which is the hill that is closest to the foreground. I have one for the set with the main characters, and I have 4 different scenes for the crowd alone. One problem with working like that is that it limits the amount of changes that you can bring in your scene. If you tweak, say, the sun angle, then you will need to change it in every other Blender file. And one way to overcome this is to work with linked collections. You can tell Blender to use collection from another file, which means that any change that you bring to it will be applied to all the relevant Blender files. I personally did my splitting as late as I could in the project after all the big changes were baked in basically, so I did not need to do that. But I still need to optimize my scenes a little bit. One of the easiest fixes is to delete all the non-visible geometry. That includes the geometry that's below the stairs or outside of the camera frame. Be careful, however, not to delete the geometry that's casting shadows into the scene. Now, sometimes when rendering alembics with cycles, which is the case with those clothes imported from Marvel's designer, you will get the occasional jumpy vertex bug or transparent meshes where you can see the character's skin below the clothes. Now, the first issue can usually be solved by turning off auto smooth, which, by the way, should always be turned off. It just breaks everything that has motion blur applied to it. And the second one took me a while to figure out, but basically when we animate our characters in Blender, we usually use the Bezier interpolation on our keyframes to smooth out the animations. But the close simulation that's baked into the Alembic file assumes a linear interpolation between the keyframes. So the result is that when rendering with motion blur, within a small fraction of a single frame, the skin geometry will still follow that Bezier interpolation and end up temporarily above the cloth for a fraction of a second, which is producing that weird result. There's probably a much better way to fix this, but what I did is simply bake my character animations and force their keyframes to be linear. Now let's talk about rendering settings for a minute. I'm using cycle to render on GPU. I commonly see people asking what sample count is required to achieve a certain render quality. That's the wrong approach. By default, Cycles is configured to use a noise threshold, which is the amount of noise that you will tolerate in the final render. The max sample count is just the absolute maximum amount that Cycles will throw at your render in case it does not reach the noise threshold. Now, by default, that threshold is set to 1%. I think it's a good value that provides almost no visible noise, but to increase your render speed, you can crank it up to something like 2% or 5%. 10% is probably where you will start to have a little bit of noise visible in the more difficult areas. With denoising, that will get you some visible mushiness and artifacts. Now, in the Advanced tab, I make sure to turn on the animated seed for the noise pattern. This ensures that each frame has a slightly different sampling pattern, and it reduces the denoising artifacts that are caused by that over time, frame by frame. In the Light Path tab, you want to keep your bounces down to a reasonable level. For diffuse and glossy, you will hardly see any differences if you go above 3 or 4. No need to go any higher than that. Transmission and transparent, however, that will be very specific to your scene. Personally, I need to have them set a bit higher. Down in the Performance tab, the Persistent Data checkbox will ensure that some of the static data that is used in render remains in memory frame after frame, which really speeds up the build-up at the start of each frame. Now, let's turn to the output settings. I render all of my layers in 4K, except for the main layer, which is the one with the set and the characters. I've rendered that one in a bit more than 4K and then I shrunk it down in post. That helps a lot with keeping a very sharp image. An alternative to that is to decrease the pixel filter width in the Film tab. Then I'm exporting my passes in a multi-layer EXR with 32 bits of data. First off, it's actually lighter than PNG, even though the PNG stores less data. And the increased bit depth allows a huge amount of non-destructive post-processing after. I didn't want to make the compositing too complex, so what I did is I created one beauty layer, and then for the ease of mind of just being able to turn up or down specific lights in case I need to, one additional layer for each relevant light groups. And then the masks that I will need for compositing thanks to Cryptomats. The scene color management is set to default, which should be using AGX in the latest Blender versions. Now, note that turning it to false colors can be quite useful to check the overall exposure in your scene. Alright, we tackled rendering, let's move on to post-processing. Apart from just assembling my layer stack into the final image in After Effects, there's a bit of adjustments and small additions going on over here. First off, the background lacks atmosphere and depth. I've added some clouds with a quite simple method. So I have a folder full of cloud pictures I took, which I can then turn into masks in After Effects. Now, I know a lot of people simply use their texture in overlay mode. The issue with that is that you don't have any control over the color of your texture. So here's an alternative. The color comes from an additional layer, which can be a solid color or gradient color, anything you like. And then you use your texture as an alpha mask for this layer. Now, this will require you to use the channel shift effect to link the opacity of the image to its luminosity. And if you want to mask out parts of that new image, you will need to pre-compose both into a new composition and do your masking on that composition. Now at that point I'm seeing some bugs and issues with some of the render layers, so I'm jumping back and forth between After Effects and Blender and re-rendering very small areas for quick and easy fixes. I've also added a few glowy layers here and there to add some separation between the foreground and the background. I've also made the essentials of color correction here in After Effects. My goal here was to achieve the naturalist look that I mentioned earlier from Thomas Cole's paintings, but with a bit more emphasis on the foreground and the characters rather than on the vegetation. So I kind of had to mute some colors and play with my levels to get there. And then I moved into DaVinci Resolve to finish off my grading and polish my render. Now most of my edits happen in the color tab. Now I'm kicking things off with slight adjustments on my levels and the overall saturation. But then to break the digital aspect of the render and get closer to an analog film look, I add a little bit of blur and then some overglow on the image. Then a very subtle vignette and then some local adjustments on color, especially on the greens. Now, I do have to mention that I am colorblind, so if you do not like my grading... And then I've added some subtle lens reflection, a bit of lens distortion, a tasteful amount of chromatic aberration, and finally some film grain. And that makes the rendered animation complete. Participating in this challenge has been exhilarating. It pushed me beyond what I already knew and made me experiment with new tools and workflows. And overall, I'm just so happy to be part of that community experience where each artist is a unique brick in this huge monument. I'm just so honored to be part of the top 100 and baffled by the overall quality and the diversity in styles and approaches and backgrounds. To my fellow artists, I want to encourage you to keep that curiosity leading you in your quest for expression. Open-mindedness is our strongest quality. So do keep exploring. Accept to let go of social media trends and tropes. Don't keep yourself locked in full digital art. History of art spans way back and is part of what makes us humans unique in nature, and you are part of that. Mankind has crafted art in so many diverse ways, and I really do think that in the end what matters most is the message, not the language. So, a message of encouragement for every artist. Don't fret too much about what softwares you should be using. Don't worry about what people think of your art. Don't stress too much about what industry standards and textbook methods dictate you to do. Just focus on what's essential for you. Learn to love the creative process. You are unique, you are awesome, and you matter. And you have the power to share your unique point of view of the world, your emotional perspective of your surroundings. Now with that, I wish you all the best. Take care.